Don't be afraid. I'm here, she whispered with 3 bullets already inside her. Then she went limp in his arms. His name was Carter Moretti, 37 years old, head of the most powerful crime family in New England, a man people crossed the street to avoid. He'd spent 20 years in that world, and in all that time, nobody had ever stepped in front of a gun for him without being paid to do it. Her name was Cynthia Quinn. 27, a clinic nurse at St. Bartholomew Medical Center who worked doubles, ate lunch in the supply closet because the cafeteria cost too much, and had been publicly reprimanded by the department chief that very morning over a system error she didn't cause and hadn't said a word to defend herself. She never did. She couldn't afford to. To everyone in that building, she was invisible. And for 3 years, on the first Tuesday of every month, Carter Moretti had walked into her clinic for a checkup on a condition no machine could ever find. Nothing was wrong with him. His doctor had told him so 36 times. He kept coming back anyway. And every single time, the quiet nurse nobody noticed had noticed him. She'd never spoken more than 4 sentences to him in her life. So when the shooters came through those doors, and the barrel came up on the most dangerous man in the state, nobody expected the invisible one to be the first to move. Not his men. Not the gunman. Not him. Why would a woman with nothing take 3 bullets for a man like that? Why does a man who fears nothing keep coming back to a hospital that can't find a thing wrong with him? And what happens to a mafia boss when the only person who ever saved his life stops breathing in his arms? If this story's already got you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Share it with someone who could use a story like this today. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to the beginning. Cynthia Quinn had learned something no nursing school had ever taught her. The cheapest way to survive in this world was to take up as little space as possible. At 5:40 on Tuesday morning, she was already sitting in the plastic chair beside bed number 7 at the dialysis center on Chalkstone Avenue. The center opened at 6 o'clock. She always arrived 20 minutes early because Ethan always needed those exact 20 minutes. He was 16 years old. This was the 14th month. 3 sessions a week, 4 hours each. He knew every stain on the ceiling of that room, every beep from every machine, even the order in which the nurses walked past. He wasn't afraid of the machine. He had never been afraid of the machine. He was afraid of the needle. 172 sessions, Ethan said, his eyes still fixed on the ceiling. I counted, 172 times, and I'm still scared. I guess there really is something wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with you. You say that because you're my sister. I say it because I do this for a living. Ethan smiled, the kind of smile worn by a boy trying to look stronger than he truly felt, knowing perfectly well that the person beside him could see straight through the act, yet smiling anyway because it was the only thing he could still do for himself. The technician pushed the cart over. Ethan gripped the edge of the blanket. His entire left arm, where the arteriovenous fistula lay beneath the skin, had hardened into a raised ridge that he never rolled up his sleeve to show anyone, not even at home. Go home and get some sleep, he said quickly. You're working a double shift. I can do this by myself. I mean it. Cynthia didn't move. She held out her hand, and Ethan took it quickly, as though if he waited even 1 second longer, his pride might stop him. Don't be afraid, she said. I'm here. The needle went in. Ethan held his breath for 4 seconds, then let it out. That was all. Those 4 seconds were the entire reason she had gotten up at 5 o'clock. At 6:40, she walked out to the parking lot. At 6:52, she parked on the second level of the garage at St. Bartholomew Medical Center, reached into the back seat for her second scrub top, and changed right there in the car. She did it every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Going home to change would have cost her another 20 minutes, and she had already spent those 20 minutes at the dialysis center. A person was given only so much time in a morning, and Cynthia had decided long ago where she would spend hers. At 7 o'clock, she was in the outpatient clinic. During her 3 years in that building, Cynthia had built a system for herself. It wasn't a philosophy of life. She didn't have time for philosophy. It was simply a system made up of 3 rules, and she followed them as strictly as she followed sterile procedure. The first rule was to take the shifts no one else wanted. Sunday shifts, holiday shifts, other people's shifts when their children had school performances. She took them all, and every time she gave the same answer, saying she was free anyway. even though she hadn't had a single free day since the summer 3 years earlier. The second rule was never to take credit. That morning, a first-year resident prescribed twice the proper dose of anticoagulant medication for a 78-year-old patient. Cynthia saw it on the screen at 7:20. She didn't report him to anyone above him. She picked up the chart, went to find him, held it out, and said she might have misread a line, and would he please check it again for her. The resident looked again, turned pale, corrected the dosage, then went to the supervising physician and said he had discovered his own mistake. Cynthia returned to the nurse's station and continued working. The 78-year-old patient lived. That was the only part of the story that mattered to her. The third rule was never to argue. At 9 o'clock, 2 patients were booked for the same appointment time. The mistake had been made by the admissions department. The charge nurse asked who had scheduled them, and 3 people turned to look at Cynthia at the same time. Cynthia said she was sorry, then spent 30 minutes making calls and rescheduling each patient. She didn't say that she didn't even have access to the scheduling system. She simply apologized and fixed the problem. Cassie Doyle had once asked her why she didn't argue back. Cynthia had answered with a shrug, and the conversation had drifted somewhere else. But she had worked out the real answer long ago, and it was simple enough to be cruel. Arguing meant losing her job. Losing her job meant losing her insurance. Losing her insurance meant Ethan would no longer have his medication. That chain had only 4 links, and she had counted them often enough that she never needed to count them again. People could call it cowardice. Cynthia didn't argue with that word either. She only knew that self-respect was a commodity, and she couldn't afford to buy it. At 10:15, she changed the dressing on a patient with diabetes. At 11 o'clock, she took the blood pressure of 4 people in a row. At noon, she quickly ate the bread she had brought from home. She did all of those things well. She always did. There was simply no reason for anyone in that building to remember. That evening, she reached the 3rd-floor apartment at 9:20. Ethan was asleep in the chair, his math book lying face down on his chest, the desk lamp still on. Cynthia went into the kitchen and pulled open the second drawer to the left of the sink. There were no spoons or forks inside. There were bills. She pulled out the stack of papers, spread them across the table out of habit, and arranged them by date. The co-payments for the dialysis sessions, medication, the tests from the previous quarter, the ambulance bill from that night, the previous September, when Ethan's potassium had dropped, and she had called 911 without having time to think about how much a ride like that would cost. She added it all again using the calculator on her phone, even though she already knew the number by heart. $61,300. One more envelope lay at the very bottom, still unopened. She had left it there for 11 days. Cynthia didn't open it that night. She put everything back in its original order, pushed the drawer closed, went into the living room, turned off the desk lamp, and covered her brother with a blanket. Then she sat on the edge of the chair in the darkness and rested for a little while, though not for long, because she had a 7 o'clock shift the next morning. The first Tuesday of every month was always different, not because of the work schedule, which was exactly the same as every other Tuesday, but because Cynthia knew that at around 9 o'clock in the morning, the glass door of the outpatient clinic would open, and that man would walk in. She didn't mark the day on any calendar. She simply knew, in the way people know they'll smell coffee before they step into the kitchen. That morning, she was standing at the nurse's station, re-entering the readings for a patient with high blood pressure, when Cassie Doyle set a paper cup of coffee in front of her, black with no sugar, exactly the way Cynthia drank it, then said nothing and didn't leave. Cassie merely leaned one shoulder against the filing cabinet and stood there, her finger tapping lightly against the edge of the counter to the rhythm of no particular song. That was how Cassie comforted people. She didn't ask if they were all right, didn't pat them on the shoulder, didn't say the things people usually said. She simply stayed. Cassie had stayed like that many times over the past 3 years, and every time she did, Cynthia felt strangely uncomfortable, not because she was being disturbed, but because she was being seen, and there was something Cassie had never told anyone. She had worked with enough timid people to know what they looked like. People who were truly shy seemed uncomfortable inside their own bodies. They didn't know where to put their hands. Their shoulders drew inward as though they were bracing against a wind that wasn't there, and their eyes slipped away before they could meet anyone else's. Cynthia wasn't like that. Cynthia stood very steadily. She knew exactly where her hands were, and exactly where her eyes were looking. She didn't look like someone who was afraid to take up space. She looked like someone who had sat down and carefully calculated how much space she was permitted to occupy, then cut herself a piece of precisely that size, not a fraction of an inch more. Those were two entirely different things, and Cassie had thought about the difference more often than she cared to admit. At 5 minutes to 9, the door opened. Cynthia didn't look up. She heard it. That was all. The rhythm of those footsteps was different from a patient's, slower and more even, without the haste of someone afraid of being late, and without the dragging gait of someone in pain. She waited for 4 steps before glancing past her screen, then over her shoulder. He had already taken his seat. He always sat in the second chair from the column, in the innermost row. Cynthia had noticed it during the first year, and had taken another year to understand why. It was the only chair in the waiting room from which the person sitting there could look directly at both entrances at once, without turning his head. Once, someone else had been sitting in that chair, so he stood. He stood for 40 minutes while he waited to be called, his back against the wall and his face turned toward the door, even though the entire row of chairs across from him was empty. He was a tall man with dark hair and the stillness of someone who didn't need to be noticed by anyone in order to feel at ease. That was all Cynthia allowed herself to observe about his appearance. Everything else belonged to habit, and she remembered habits more clearly. For instance, he never touched his phone. Everyone else in the waiting room bent over a screen, even those who sat for only 3 minutes, but he rested both hands on his thighs and watched the door. 40 minutes. He didn't read anything, listen to anything, or look at the clock on the wall. Once, his phone vibrated inside his jacket pocket, and he took it out, looked at the screen for exactly 1.5 seconds, then put it away without answering. Cynthia had counted that 1.5 seconds, and she knew there was something faintly embarrassing about having counted it, so she never told anyone. And then there was the watch. He wore it on his left wrist, an old watch with a worn leather strap and a crack running diagonally across the crystal from the upper left edge almost to the center, the kind of spiderweb fracture that could only come from striking something very hard. Everything else he wore was expensive, so expensive that Cynthia couldn't even guess the price. The watch wasn't. The watch looked like something a person might have bought at an ordinary store more than a dozen years ago. And every time he entered the examination room, the first thing he did, even before sitting down, was remove it and place it on the corner of the desk with the face turned upward. He didn't hand it to anyone for safekeeping, and didn't put it in his pocket. He placed it on the desk. Then, when the examination was over, he picked it up and fastened it around his wrist again before he stood. 36 times. Cynthia knew because she had seen all 36 of them. At 9:20, she crossed the waiting room with a stack of medical charts in her arms and didn't look over. She had trained herself not to look over. What she hadn't trained herself to stop doing was slowing down by half a step at that exact spot, and Cassie was standing right behind the counter. "You know I saw that, don't you?" Cassie said when Cynthia returned. "Saw what?" "Saw you walk past there like you were stepping around a pothole." Cynthia set the stack of charts down. "I was going to get the files." "I didn't say you weren't going to get the files. I didn't look at anyone. I didn't say you looked at anyone either." Cynthia opened the chart on top and stared down at it with great concentration, even though the first page was nothing but a blank registration form. Cassie watched her for a few more seconds, then picked up her own cup of coffee and walked toward the supply room, and Cynthia heard her laughing softly halfway down the hall. She lowered her head, entered the information, and worked through the rest of the morning with the same precision and steady rhythm she brought to every day. And not one person who passed the nurse's station that morning could have guessed that the nurse sitting there had just spent 40 minutes listening for the sound of a man's footsteps beyond the door, without looking up even. Once, that same afternoon, less than 2 miles from the hospital, Carter Moretti sat at the last table in a restaurant on Federal Hill and waited for a man named Russo to walk in. The restaurant had been closed since 3 o'clock. On the table before him lay only a thin folder and a pen. Matteo Ferraro stood in the corner of the room, 4 steps from the kitchen door, in the precise spot from which he could see both the main entrance and the hallway leading to the cold storage room. He didn't lean against the wall. In the 11 years Matteo had worked for this family, he had never leaned against a wall anywhere, and the people who had noticed eventually stopped asking why. At 3:10, Russo arrived. He was 43 years old, managed 3 restaurants in the neighborhood, and over the past 2 years, he had taken an amount of money from the books of those 3 restaurants that he had convinced himself was too small for anyone to bother noticing. He sat in the chair across from Carter. No one told him to sit. Carter said nothing for nearly 10 seconds. He simply opened the folder, turned it sideways, and pushed it across the table toward Russo. The top page was a comparison of revenue and ingredient costs over 24 months, with the discrepancies marked. The second page contained copies of 3 commercial leases, all 3 in the name of a company Russo had never heard of, and all 3 signed before he had taken the job. The third page was a transfer agreement for Russo's ownership interest in the small cafe on Atwell's Avenue that he had opened the year before with that very money. Everything had already been filled in except for one signature line. Russo looked at the third page longest. "Mr. Moretti, I can explain." "I didn't ask," Carter said. His voice was no louder than that of a man ordering a meal. "I've already read it. All 24 months. You don't need to tell me what I've already read." Russo fell silent. Carter pushed the pen across the table, a single deliberate motion, and it stopped within easy reach of Russo's hand. "Sign it, then walk out through the front door." Russo looked up. For one very brief moment, he didn't understand. Then he did. The front door was the same door through which he had entered, opening onto a Federal Hill sidewalk in broad daylight, where there was a bakery line, people walking their dogs, and 3 cameras mounted outside the shop next door. In the world he had willingly entered 2 years earlier, being allowed to leave through the front door was an answer, and it was a far more merciful answer than the one he had prepared himself for on the way there. His hand trembled as he picked up the pen. He signed. Carter gathered the papers, tapped their edges against the table until they were straight, and didn't look at him again. "You're younger than I thought," he said after Russo had risen to his feet. "You'll find another job. Don't look for one in this neighborhood." Russo left. The glass door swung shut behind him. Matteo didn't move from his position until the footsteps on the sidewalk had faded far enough into the distance. Only then did he leave the corner and lock the door. Vincent Aldo emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of Carter, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He didn't ask. He never asked. In this room, and in every other room over the 7 years since Carter had taken control, Vincent Aldo was the only man who sat without waiting for permission, and the only man whose sitting Carter never seemed to notice. He was 56 years old, and had stood beside Carter's father before he stood beside Carter. He also had a habit of stirring his coffee for a very long time before taking a drink. "You let him walk out through the front door," Aldo said. "He stole from 3 restaurants, not from people. Some will call that softness. Some will." Aldo nodded slowly. "But if you'd handled him the old way, I'd have to find new managers for all 3 places next week, and no one in this neighborhood would dare take the jobs. You calculated correctly." He took a sip, then set the cup down. "Today is the first Tuesday of the month." Carter didn't answer. "Did you go?" "This morning." "Good." Aldo stirred his coffee again, even though it had already gone cold. "Don't stop going, Carter. I mean that. There have been years when I watched you walk out of that clinic, and every decision you made the following day was clearer and wiser. You need it. I don't understand why, and I don't need to understand, but you need it, so don't stop." Carter looked at him for a moment, then said thank you. And that was the end of it. Aldo rose, carried both cups into the kitchen, washed them by hand as he always did, then left after reminding Matteo to lock the back door. When only the 2 men remained, Matteo walked over and stood beside the table. He didn't sit. "May I ask you a question?" "You just did. The real question." Carter pushed the folder aside. "Go ahead. For the past 3 years, you've gone to that clinic at the beginning of every month. I've driven you there 36 times. 36 times. I've sat outside in the car and waited. And 36 times, you've come back out wearing the same expression." Matteo paused. "I know what Dr. Brandt tells you. I can guess what he says. Because if you were truly ill, I would have had to rearrange your schedule a long time ago. So I'm asking, what do you go there for?" Outside, a car passed by, and then the sound faded completely. Carter picked up the leather-strapped watch from the table where he had placed it, when he sat down and fastened it around his left wrist, with a motion so familiar that he didn't need to look. He rose to his feet. "Lock the back door," he said, and walked outside. That same Tuesday morning, St. Bartholomew's electronic medical record system ran an update at midnight, and no one was notified. At 8:12 that morning, Cynthia Quinn discovered it. She was opening the prescription order for a patient with heart failure, who was 71 years old, when she saw that the unit field was blank. Not incorrect. Blank. The dosage column still showed a number, but the unit beside it had disappeared. And a number without a unit could mean milligrams, could mean milliliters, could mean anything the person reading it supplied in their own mind. She opened a second order, blank as well. A third order, for an intravenous diuretic, was blank too. Cynthia didn't call anyone. She opened the handwritten medication sheets for those 3 patients from the drawer, checked every line, wrote down the correct units. You then printed all 3 orders and clipped them to the front of the paper charts so that anyone retrieving the medication would have to see them before touching the cabinet. At 8:19, she called the technical support line. It wasn't open yet. She called the internal number for the information technology department. The phone rang 9 times, and no one answered. She typed a message through the hospital's internal system, identifying all 3 order codes exactly, describing the missing data field exactly, and adding that the error was most likely present in every prescription entered after midnight. She sent it at 8:22. Then she continued to the next examination room and administered the correct dose in the correct unit to a patient, without saying a single word to anyone about what had just happened, because in the system she had built for herself, reporting was mandatory, but retelling was not. At 8:35, Dr. Preston Vance stepped out of the elevator. He was 46 years old, the head of the department, and that morning he was accompanied by 4 first-year residents in the first week of their outpatient rotation. He stopped at the nurse's station, picked up the paper charts with the 3 printed sheets clipped to the front, flipped through them once, then set them down. Who did this? Cynthia was standing 3 steps away. I did. You printed out paper orders and clipped them to the charts. Do you know what that's called? He didn't wait for an answer. It's called working outside the system. We have electronic medical records precisely so mistakes like this don't happen. You wrote medication units on pieces of paper with your own hand, clipped them to the charts, and expected someone to trust those pieces of paper more than the software. The 4 residents stood in a semicircle behind him. The 2 people at reception stopped typing. Cassie Doyle had just emerged from the side corridor and halted halfway across the floor. I'm sorry, Cynthia said. I don't need you to apologize. I need you to understand. Vance tapped one finger against the counter twice. You've worked here for 3 years, and you're still clipping pieces of paper to charts, as though it were 1990. I've already spoken to the charge nurse about this twice. He turned halfway toward the 4 residents, and that was when his voice changed. It didn't grow louder. It merely slowed, with the deliberate slowness of a man who knew he had an audience. Look carefully. In hospitals, people don't die because doctors are incompetent. Incompetent doctors are identified within 6 months. People die because of those who do things almost right, who believe almost right is good enough, and who refuse to admit when they aren't certain. People like you are the reason patients die. No one said anything. Cynthia placed both hands flat against the counter. Inside her mind, everything moved quickly and cleanly, following the exact order she had calculated thousands of times before. She could turn on the screen right now. She could point to the blank unit fields on all 3 orders, open the message she had sent at 8:22, and within 40 seconds, all 4 of those residents would understand that the 3 pieces of paper being condemned as outdated were the only thing standing between a patient who was 71 years old and a dose of medication with no unit attached to it. She also knew what would happen after those 40 seconds. Vance would be proven wrong in front of 4 new residents. He wouldn't forget it. He wouldn't need to do anything dramatic. He would only have to wait 4 months, until the hospital reduced staffing in the outpatient clinic as it did every year, and write 1 short sentence in the comments box about her ability to cooperate. After that came the insurance. And after the insurance came Ethan. That chain had 4 links, and she had counted them long ago. Yes, doctor, Cynthia said. I'll learn from this. Vance gave a single nod, picked up the charts, and led the 4 residents toward examination room number 2. The 3 paper sheets remained clipped to the front. He didn't remove them. At the far end of the corridor, about 50 feet away, Matteo Ferraro stood waiting with a cup of water in his hand, because he always entered the building first and made a full circuit before Carter walked through the door. He had watched the entire exchange, and he noticed something no one else in that corridor had noticed. The nurse being reprimanded hadn't lowered her face, nor had she looked directly at the man reprimanding her. Throughout the nearly full minute she stood there, her eyes moved past his shoulder, traveled down the corridor behind him, paused very briefly at the east fire exit, then at the stairwell door, then at the space between 2 filing cabinets wide enough to conceal 1 person, and then returned. That wasn't the gaze of someone enduring humiliation. It was the gaze of someone counting. Matteo knew that habit. He had it himself, and he had never been able to turn it off. He said nothing to anyone. He simply memorized her face, then walked outside to wait for the car. A few minutes later, Cassie passed the nurse's station, set a cup of coffee down in front of Cynthia, and didn't say a word. At 9:10, Carter Moretti sat down on the edge of the examination table in room number 4 and did the thing he always did first. He removed the leather-strapped watch from his left wrist and placed it on the corner of the desk. Its face turned upward. Dr. Julian Brandt pulled the electrocardiogram machine closer, attached 10 electrodes, pressed the button, and for 60 seconds, the only sound in the room was paper feeding through the machine. Brandt was 36, 1 year younger than Carter. The two of them had attended the same high school on the north side of the city, and over the past 20 years, their lives had taken them in directions so distant from each other that they no longer had anything to discuss beyond this room itself. He tore off the strip of paper, read it, then set it on the desk and pulled up a chair across from Carter. Sinus rhythm, 72. No conduction abnormalities, no ST segment changes, no pathological Q waves. He turned to the results of that morning's blood tests. Troponin is negative. Cardiac enzymes are normal. Your cholesterol is better than mine. The nurse will check your blood pressure again in a moment, but last time it was 118/76. Carter said nothing. Brandt removed the stethoscope from around his neck, folded it, and placed it on the desk. It was the gesture he made when he stopped being a doctor. 36 times. Carter, I've had you undergo electrocardiograms, echocardiograms, 24-hour Holter monitoring, stress tests, and a contrast coronary angiogram 14 months ago. I've looked. I looked harder than I needed to because you're my friend and because you pay me to look. He paused. There's nothing wrong with your heart. There never has been. Carter lowered his eyes to the corner of the desk where the watch lay. The crack in its crystal caught the overhead light and became a thin, bright line running diagonally from the upper left edge almost to the center. He stared at it longer than anyone would stare at a watch simply to check the time. Then why does it still hurt? Brandt didn't answer. He opened his mouth, then stopped. He reached for the medical chart, opened it, then closed it again without writing a word. They both knew the answer. They had both known it for 3 years, and in the 36 times they had sat in this room, neither of them had ever spoken it aloud, because speaking it aloud meant giving it a name, and once it had a name, something else would have to happen afterward, something neither of them was ready for. I'll have the nurse come in and check your blood pressure again, Brandt said, rising to his feet. Cynthia was standing at the nurse's station when she saw the light for examination room number 4 come on. She checked the monitor, replaced the cuff, and walked down the corridor. When she reached the door, she stopped for half a second, not to prepare herself, but merely to give something inside her chest time to settle. Then she knocked twice and stepped inside. He was sitting on the edge of the examination table, his left sleeve already rolled up. No one had told him to roll it up. He had done this 36 times before. I'm going to take your blood pressure, Cynthia said, and she heard that her voice sounded normal and felt relieved because of it. She wrapped the cuff around his arm. Her fingertips touched his skin for about a second as she smoothed the edge of the cuff, and her hand trembled. Not much, just enough for her to know. She hated that her hand had trembled. In 3 years of working in the outpatient clinic, her hands had never shaken once, not even that morning, 3 weeks earlier when she had stood at the nurse's station with both palms pressed flat against the wooden counter while an entire corridor watched. She squeezed the rubber bulb, watched the needle, released the pressure slowly, and read the measurement. 120/74. She removed the cuff and began rolling it up, and that was when he spoke. What's your name? Cynthia's hands stopped. In 3 years, they had been in the same room 36 times. She had taken his blood pressure, handed him his test forms, and directed him to the blood draw room on the first floor. Not once had he looked directly into her eyes, not because he looked down on her, but because that was how he existed in every room. His eyes passed over people to find the exits behind them. Now he was looking straight into her eyes, and Cynthia realized that she had never known what color his eyes were. Cynthia, she said. Cynthia Quinn. He gave the faintest nod. Then he repeated it once, without asking a question or adding anything more. Cynthia. That was all. He reached for the watch on the corner of the desk, fastened it around his left wrist with a motion so practiced that he didn't need to look, and stood. Cynthia finished rolling the cuff, wrote the number on the form, thanked him, and stepped into the corridor. She walked 4 steps, then stopped. She leaned back against the wall between the doors of examination rooms 4 and 5, directly beneath the sign pointing toward the X-ray department. 3 seconds. She counted 3 seconds, the way she counted everything else in her life. Then she straightened, clipped the form to the medical chart, and continued toward the nurse's station, where 2 patients were waiting. A telephone was ringing, and a long Tuesday morning still stretched ahead of her. Inside the room, Brant looked at the door that had just closed, then turned toward Carter and said nothing. At 2:14 in the afternoon, Cynthia was pushing a dressing cart through the outpatient lobby when she saw the man in the technician's uniform. He was walking against the flow. That was the first thing. At this hour, the entire lobby moved in one direction, from the reception desk toward the row of examination rooms. But he was going the other way, slowly, without urgency, carrying nothing in his hands. A technician walking through a hospital always carried something. The second thing was his neck. He wasn't looking at the patients. He raised his eyes to the southwest corner of the ceiling, where the camera was mounted, held them there for half a second, then lowered them and let them slide toward the fire exit at the end of the corridor, before lifting them again to the eastern corner of the ceiling. He was measuring. Cynthia stopped in the middle of the lobby, and something inside her, something she had buried exactly 3 years ago and believed was dead, rose before she had time to form a single thought. She glanced quickly toward the reception desk. 4 men were entering through the main doors. Not one of them stopped at the desk. Cynthia abandoned the dressing cart and took 3 steps toward the side corridor, her hand already reaching for the alarm button mounted beneath the edge of the counter. She pressed it at 4 seconds past 2:15. The first shot rang out 2 seconds later. The lobby shattered into chaos. People screamed. Chairs overturned. Someone dragged another person beneath the reception desk. Matteo Ferraro was standing beside the column to the right of the main entrance, and he was already moving before the first gunshot finished echoing. He didn't shout. He didn't look for cover. He went straight into the open space between the 2 men closest to the door, and within the next 4 seconds, both men were on the floor, one disarmed, the other no longer getting up. Then Matteo's left leg buckled. He collapsed sideways, still holding his gun, and managed to drag himself behind the base of the column. In the middle of the lobby, about 30 feet from the main entrance, Carter Moretti stood exposed. He had just stepped out of the examination corridor. There was no column near him, no counter within reach. There was only the bare tile floor and a row of low plastic chairs to his left. The third gunman had turned, and the barrel of his weapon was rising, and all Carter had time to do was begin twisting one shoulder. Cynthia made no decision at all. Later, when people asked what she had been thinking in that moment, she would answer truthfully that she hadn't been thinking anything. Not a single sentence passed through her mind. There was no calculation, no fear, no choice. Her body did it, and it moved faster than the part of her that understood what it was doing. She pushed away from the wall, ran diagonally across the open floor, and during the last 3 steps, her heels no longer touched the ground. She struck him in the chest with her shoulder and both arms, not to shield him, but to push him. 3 gunshots, so close together that the first and second sounded like one. They both went down. The tile floor was cold and hard, and it came up very fast. Something metal struck the ground and rolled away. Somewhere behind them, a plastic cup shattered beneath someone's foot. There were footsteps running toward the door. Then came 2 more shots, the final 2, from the base of the column where Matteo lay, and afterward, there was a strange silence broken only by the alarm bell and the sound of someone crying behind the counter. Carter was on his knees. He couldn't remember how he had managed to sit up. He knew only that he was kneeling on the lobby floor, both hands pressed against her body, pushing down. This man hadn't knelt before anyone in 20 years, not before a judge, not before his own men, not before his father on the final day of his life. Now he was kneeling in the middle of a hospital, both knees on the tile, his hands trying to hold on to a woman whose name he had learned only 10 minutes earlier. "Look at me," he said. His voice didn't sound like his own. "Look at me." She opened her eyes. They searched for his face, found it, and stayed there. Then her right hand lifted from the floor and found his wrist, just beside the watch, and closed around it. Her grip wasn't strong. She no longer had enough strength to hold tightly. But she held on, and she kept holding on, and she looked straight into his eyes in a way no one in this building had looked at him in 3 years, without fear, without suspicion, without calculating who he was. She looked at him the way one person looks at another who is panicking. And she spoke very softly, more slowly than she wanted because there was no longer enough breath. One word at a time. "Don't be afraid. I'm here." Her hand slipped from his wrist and fell onto the tile. Her eyes closed. Carter called her name. He called once, then twice, and then he screamed it, and the name echoed through the entire lobby. The name he had learned at 9:15 that morning. From the base of the column, Matteo Ferraro looked across the room. He had wrapped his belt around his own thigh and pulled it tight, and he was signaling with one hand to the 2 men who had just rushed in through the side entrance, pointing toward the eastern corridor where the 4th gunman had disappeared. He did all of it with the part of his mind that was still functioning normally. But another part of him could only stare toward the center of the lobby. 11 years. For 11 years he had stood beside that man. He had seen Carter Moretti sit motionless while 3 guns were aimed at him. He had seen him sign papers while federal agents stood outside the door. He had seen him stand in a funeral home without a single muscle in his face moving. In all those 11 years, Matteo had never once seen this man panic. Now he was panicking. The gurney arrived 40 seconds later. Carter didn't move aside. 2 people in blue scrubs bent down to slide their hands beneath her back, and he spoke a single word, not loudly, and both of them stopped. He reached beneath her himself. He lifted her from the tile floor and carried her across the lobby without placing her on the gurney, without waiting for anyone to push it, walking straight into the west corridor toward the emergency department with the 2 people in blue running beside him, while no one dared touch his arms. Brandt came rushing out of the stairwell, his stethoscope still around his neck, took one look, then pulled out his phone and called directly to the 3rd floor. He spoke 3 sentences into it. "Operating room 2. Prepare blood. Get the trauma surgeon down here now." Someone stopped Carter at the entrance to the preoperative unit, and Brandt was the one who reached out to take her from him. He spoke softly, quietly enough that only Carter could hear, telling him that from this point on, he had to let them do their work. Carter stood there for another 2 seconds, then released her. The doors closed. He remained in the middle of the corridor, both hands still held in the exact position they had been in when he let her go. And he didn't move for a length of time that no one would later be able to measure. In the lobby, Matteo Ferraro was still sitting against the base of the column, with his belt cinched around his thigh. He wouldn't let anyone take him away. He made 3 calls, stationed 4 of his men at the 4 entrances to the building, then called a 5th man outside in the parking lot, and told him to record the license plate of every vehicle that had left the grounds during the previous 20 minutes. By the time the Providence police flooded into the building, he had finished all of it, and was sitting still with both hands resting on his thighs, unarmed, so they wouldn't have to wonder. They took him to the 1st floor to have the wound stitched. He returned to the 3rd floor corridor 40 minutes later on crutches, and no one could persuade him to leave. The Providence police sealed off the lobby at 2:40. The federal team arrived at 3:15. The agent in charge was a woman named Ruth Callahan, who was 44 years old, and she stopped in the middle of the lobby, looked at the marked section of tile, looked at the overturned row of plastic chairs, then lifted her eyes toward the west corridor and stood that way longer than necessary. 2 years earlier, she had opened an investigation into the Moretti family. During those 2 years, she had constructed a complete story in her mind, one with a beginning and an end, and in that story, Carter Moretti occupied a very clear place. That afternoon, she had arrived at a scene where the bullets intended for him had missed, while a 27-year-old nurse with no connection to anything in her case file was lying on an operating table because she had run toward him instead of toward the door. Callahan didn't like that. She made no attempt to hide the fact that she didn't like it. When she reached the 3rd floor and saw Carter standing in the corridor, she told him plainly that she needed his statement that day, that she had read enough about him to know he wouldn't give her anything, and that she would ask anyway because it was her job. Carter answered 4 questions, precisely and briefly, describing exactly what he had seen without adding a single word. Then he fell silent. Callahan closed her notebook. She studied him for another moment, then turned away. And before descending the stairs, she told one of the 2 agents accompanying her, without lowering her voice, that this case was nothing like anything she had prepared for. The surgery lasted 6 hours. During those 6 hours, Carter Moretti didn't sit down once. There were 14 chairs in the 3rd floor corridor. He stood about 13 feet from the operating room door, facing it, his arms hanging straight at his sides, and he remained that way from 3 in the afternoon until 9 that night. Someone brought him coffee, but he didn't take it. Someone brought him food, but he didn't look at it. His driver came upstairs and asked whether he should call a lawyer, and Carter shook his head once. Twice, the operating room doors opened so bags of blood could be carried inside, and both times he took half a step forward before stopping himself. At around 7 that evening, a nurse walking past started to place a hand on his arm to ask if he was all right, but Mateo stepped between them in time and shook his head at her. Not because Carter was dangerous, only because Mateo knew. At the other end of the corridor, Dr. Preston Vance stood beside the stairwell door. He had gone up there at 4 and hadn't come back down. He didn't approach. He didn't speak to anyone. In 20 years of practicing medicine, Preston Vance had never stood in a hospital corridor without having something to say. And that night, he stood there for 5 hours without saying a single word. At 9:12 that evening, the operating room doors opened. The trauma surgeon came out first, with Brandt behind him. They delivered the news in the order such news was always given. The patient was alive. Her vital signs were stable. The first bullet had passed through the soft tissue beneath her collarbone without striking a major blood vessel. The second had penetrated her abdomen, and they had repaired the damage during the operation. Then the surgeon paused before speaking about the third bullet. The third bullet had entered her left shoulder and damaged the brachial plexus. They had done everything they could do that night. The rest would require time. Perhaps 3 months, perhaps 6, perhaps longer. She might regain some function. She might not. Brandt delivered the final sentence more slowly than the others, and he spoke to Carter, not to anyone else in the corridor. He told him that if the strength and steadiness didn't return to her left hand, she would no longer be able to perform clinical work. Carter didn't ask him to repeat it. He said nothing at all. He merely turned his face toward the door that had just closed, and he remained standing. Cynthia regained consciousness at around 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the third day. Cassie Doyle was sitting in the chair beside her bed, and Cassie was the first person she saw. Cynthia opened her mouth and tried once, but no sound came out. Then she tried again. "Is the man from room 4 all right?" Cassie sprang to her feet. She stood there with both hands raised halfway, not knowing what to do with them. And then her eyes turned red. She looked away, and she began to cry, the way someone cries after holding everything in for 3 days, only to be broken open by one absurd question. It took her a while before she could speak. "You just spent 6 hours on an operating table. You just woke up, and the first thing you ask is whether he's all right." Cynthia didn't understand why that had made her friend cry. "He's fine," Cassie said, wiping her face with the sleeve of her shirt. "Not a scratch on him." "Cynthia, do you know who he is?" Cynthia shook her head very slightly, because that was all she could manage. "Carter Moretti." Cassie said the name and stopped, as though waiting for it to finish the rest of the work on its own. "This entire city knows that name. My father worked in Federal Hill for 20 years, and even he knew that name. The Moretti family. Cynthia, do you understand? For 3 years, you've been taking the blood pressure of the man who runs all of New England, and you never knew." Cynthia stared up at the ceiling. She thought about the second chair from the column, the only chair with a clear view of both entrances at once. She thought about the way he never touched his phone. She thought about how she'd had 3 years to understand, how she had seen every piece without ever putting them together because she had never allowed herself to. The doctor came in at 5 o'clock. They spoke to her the way people spoke to a colleague, without softening the truth or circling around it, and she was grateful for that. The brachial plexus in her left shoulder had been damaged. The surgery had repaired what needed to be addressed immediately. The rest would depend on time, physical therapy, and a little biological luck no one could prescribe. They would assess her again in 3 months. She might regain some function. She might not. After they left, Cynthia lay still for a while, then tried. She looked down at her left hand resting on the blanket and told it to close. Her fingers moved. They curled about halfway, then stopped there, trembling, before slowly extending again. She tried a second time, then a third. That hand had held a syringe 10,000 times. It had kept an intravenous line steady in the trembling arm of a 70-year-old patient in the middle of the night. Now she told it to close, and it heard her. It did hear her, but it couldn't obey. She lowered her hand and didn't try a 4th time. The next morning, Diane Kessler came down to the 5th floor. She was 53 years old, the chief executive officer of St. Bartholomew, and she carried a folder already marked with yellow sticky notes. She didn't enter Cynthia's room. She held a meeting in the administrative office at the end of the corridor, with the hospital's attorney, the nursing director, and Carter Moretti seated at the far end of the table, because he had asked to be present, and no one could find a legal reason to refuse him. Kessler read from the document. She read that at the time of the incident, Nurse Quinn had left her assigned post. She read that Cynthia's actions fell outside the scope of practice described in the job description she had signed. She read that under Clause 4.2 of the liability insurance contract, the insurer had the right to deny coverage for injuries resulting from voluntary actions performed outside assigned duties, and that the hospital was awaiting its official determination. Then she put the paper down and said the part she hadn't read from the page. She said she was sorry, truly sorry. She said she had 800 employees and an entire building to think about, and she had a duty to consider both. Then, with the utmost courtesy, she suggested that Mr. Moretti consider transferring his care to another facility, because his presence there, under the current circumstances, placed the hospital in a position she didn't know how to explain to the board of directors. No one spoke for about 5 seconds. Carter didn't strike the table. He didn't raise his voice. He sat perfectly still, and when he spoke, his voice remained as calm as that of a man ordering a meal. "Did you read that entire page of her record?" he asked. "Or did you only read the part that could get you sued?" Kessler didn't answer. She looked down at the folder in front of her, and for one very brief moment, her face became the face of someone who knew the answer perfectly well, and knew just as clearly that saying it aloud wouldn't change anything about the position in which she sat. She closed the folder, thanked everyone for their time, and left the room. The attorney followed her. Ethan called that afternoon. Cassie answered the phone first, and placed it in Cynthia's right hand. "Sis." "Yeah. Cassie said you had an accident at work." "Yeah. I slipped and fell on my shoulder." Cynthia heard how smoothly the lie came out, and she realized that she had been practicing lying to him for years without knowing it. "When are you coming home?" "In a few days." "Did you get to dialysis on time?" "Yes. Cassie drove me." "Don't worry." He fell silent for a moment. "Does it hurt?" Cynthia looked down at her left hand lying on the blanket, the hand she had just told to close and that had failed to obey. "No," she said. "I'm not in any pain at all." That night, in the back room of a restaurant on Federal Hill, Mateo placed a sheet of paper with 5 names on the table. He was still walking on crutches, and he still didn't sit down. "I started with the simplest part," he said. "They weren't lying in wait out on the street. They knew you were inside that building at that hour. 4 of them came through the main entrance at 2:15, but your appointment was at 9:15 in the morning, and you stayed until the afternoon because you had to wait for your test results. That means someone knew you were still there. But the one thing they knew for certain beforehand was the day. The first Tuesday of the month." He tapped one finger against the sheet of paper. 5 people knew that schedule. Me, Dr. Brandt, the driver, the secretary who keeps your appointment book, and Mr. Aldo. Carter looked at the paper. He read the first 4 names the way a man might read an inventory list. His eyes passed over the 5th without stopping. Something happened inside his mind at that exact moment, and it happened so quickly that he had no time to call it a thought. It was only the briefest tightening, and then it vanished, because people didn't question the structure of the building they were standing inside. They didn't look up at the beam supporting the ceiling and wonder whether it could truly bear the weight. They simply stood and walked and slept and went their whole lives without thinking about it once, because if there was something wrong with that beam, then nothing else meant anything anymore. "Cross the secretary off," Carter said. "She's only been working here 10 months. I checked her first for exactly that reason. Nothing unusual in her bank accounts, nothing unusual on her phone, and she goes home to her mother's place in Warwick every weekend." Mateo shrugged. As for the driver, he sat in the parking lot the whole time and ran inside when he heard the gunfire. If he'd known beforehand, he wouldn't have run in. The door opened. Vincent Aldo entered carrying a thick file, set it on the table, and sat down. "I have news," he said. 3 of them stayed behind that day. The police have identified 2. Both of them used to work for the Barone family in Cranston. The 3rd hasn't been identified yet, but the man at the rental agency on Reservoir Street Says the white van parked outside that day was rented with documents belonging to an industrial cleaning company, and for the past 3 years that company has had only one client. He pushed the file across the table. The Barone family. They're still bitter over that port contract last year. Matteo picked up the file and began turning through it. Carter didn't. He merely looked at Aldo. What do you think? I think they're stupid, Aldo said. Attacking someone inside a hospital is stupid. Now federal agents are all over that building, and the person in charge isn't the kind of agent who asks questions merely to say she asked them. He paused and stirred the coffee he had just poured for himself. And I think something else, Carter. Whether you listen is up to you. Say it. Leave the nurse alone. Aldo looked up. I'm not saying you're ungrateful. I'm saying the opposite. You stood outside that operating room for 6 hours, and everyone in the building saw you. Now the federal agents have her name in their file because she was the nearest witness. The closer you get to her, the more valuable a target she becomes. If the Barone family wants to hurt you but doesn't dare touch you, then you've just shown them where they can strike. He set down his cup. If you want to pay her medical bills, do it through a foundation. You don't need to sign anything. Then let it end there. That's the best way you can protect her. No one spoke. Matteo looked at Carter. Carter lowered his eyes to the tabletop. You're right, he said. On Friday morning, Ruth Callahan arranged to meet him at a coffee shop on Wickenden Street, chose the table farthest from the door, and arrived 20 minutes early. She brought no files with her. She spoke plainly, saying that she cared less about the Barone family than she did about who had paid the Barone family, that she had been following the Moretti case for 2 years and knew he wouldn't give her anything, and that she was still offering him the chance to cooperate, because it was her job to do so, and because, for the first time in 2 years, she had a reason to believe the offer wasn't entirely meaningless. Carter listened to all of it. Then he said no. There was no malice in the word. It was almost polite, the kind of refusal given by a man who had refused the same thing so many times that he no longer felt any need to explain. Callahan nodded, finished her coffee, and stood. She slipped the strap of her bag over her shoulder, then stopped beside the table. Mr. Moretti, I'm going to ask you one question. You don't have to answer me. She looked down at him. You haven't left that building all week. You stood outside an operating room for 6 hours. You sat through an administrative meeting in which you had no personal interest. So, let me ask you this. She paused for a beat. Are you protecting an institution, or are you protecting one person inside it? She didn't wait. She stepped onto the sidewalk, turned left, and disappeared around the corner. Carter remained alone at the table for about 10 minutes. Then he called Matteo. You still have someone in the hospital's human resources department? Yes. Get me Cynthia Quinn's personnel file. All of it. From the first day she set foot inside that building. Matteo was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. What do you need it for? Just get it, Carter said, and ended the call. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the 5th floor intensive care unit held nothing but the sound of machines and the low hum of the air conditioning. Cynthia couldn't sleep. She lay on her right side because it was the only side she could still lie on, her eyes open, watching the thin line of light spilling through the crack beneath the door. Then that line of light widened, and someone stepped into the room. She knew who it was before she saw his face, because she had heard the rhythm of those footsteps 36 times in 3 years. He stopped at the foot of the bed. He didn't pull up a chair. He didn't come any closer than necessary. You're awake. Yes. I want to ask you one question. Cynthia nodded. Barely. Why did you do it? She didn't answer at once. She had known this question would come, and during the 3 nights she had spent lying there, she had prepared several answers. Neat and reasonable answers. Things like professional instinct, things like anyone else would have done the same. They were all partly true, and none of them was the truth. Do you want the honest answer? I didn't walk up here at 3 o'clock in the morning to hear any other kind. Cynthia lowered her eyes to the blanket. She stared at the fold in the fabric along the edge of the bed, and she spoke to that fold because she couldn't bring herself to look at him. Because in the 3 years I've worked in this building, you're the only person who ever greeted me by name. She heard her own voice grow softer. Everyone else called me Nurse. Nurse, can I ask you something? Nurse, could you get this for me? The doctors, the patients, their families. 3 years. I don't blame anyone. I understand. People are busy, they have their own lives, and my name badge is small. She paused for a moment. But you asked me my name, then you called me Cynthia. only once. That morning, she fell silent. The entire room was silent. Carter Moretti had sat in hundreds of rooms, and in nearly all of them, he was the one who decided when the conversation began and when it ended. He knew how to make silence do his work for him. He knew how to answer a question by not answering it at all. In 20 years, no one had ever said anything to him for which he didn't already have the next words prepared. Now he stood at the foot of her bed, and he had nothing. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He thought about that morning. The morning when he had asked her name without knowing why he was asking, after Brandt had set the stethoscope down on the desk and told him the same thing he had heard 36 times before. He thought that if anyone had told him a 4-word sentence could make someone run toward the barrel of a gun, he would have called them a liar. And he thought about how, for 3 years, he had passed that nurse's station dozens of times and had seen nothing at all. He stepped to the side of the bed. He reached for his left wrist, unfastened the leather strap of his watch, and placed it on the small table beside her bed, its face turned upward, exactly as he always placed it on the corner of the desk in the examination room. For 3 years, that watch had left his wrist in only one place inside this building, and it wasn't this room. He said nothing about it. He offered no explanation. He simply set it down and drew his hand away. Cynthia looked at it. She had seen that watch 36 times. She had counted the crack running diagonally across its crystal, and had wondered about it more often than she cared to admit. Now it lay about 8 inches from her right hand. She didn't ask. There was something in the way he had set it down that made her understand this wasn't the time to ask. And perhaps there would never be a time. And she thought that if a day came when he wanted to tell her, he would tell her himself. "Go to sleep," he said. "Yes. Dr. Brandt says they can't evaluate you again for another 3 months. Yes." He nodded once, then walked out. At the door, he stopped halfway through a step without turning around. "Don't get up when I come in. Just stay where you are." Then he left. Cynthia lay still for a very long time afterward. She didn't cry. She merely lay on her side, looking at the watch face turned toward the ceiling, and the crack caught the light from the doorway and became a slender, shining line. She thought about how, for 3 years, she had taught herself that no one remembering her name was normal, that it was simply the price she had to pay for a quiet life, and she had believed it. She had believed it so completely that she had never once opened the thought and examined it again. Now one person had called her by the right name a single time, and only then did she understand how desperately hungry she had been for that one small thing. Outside, about 13 feet from the door to her room, Dr. Preston Vance stood in the corridor. His night shift had just ended, and he had already passed this room 3 times. This time, he slowed down. He looked through the small pane of glass in the door, looked at the nameplate fixed to the doorframe, and stood there with one hand resting on the handle. He remained that way longer than he intended. Then he lowered his hand, turned away, and walked toward the elevator. He didn't go inside. He still didn't know what he would say if he did. Cynthia was discharged on the 9th day. 2 days later, at around 7 o'clock in the evening, someone knocked on the door of the 3rd-floor apartment. She went to the door and unlocked it with her right hand, and Carter Moretti was standing alone in the hallway. Matteo wasn't with him. No one was waiting at the foot of the stairs. He hadn't brought anything. "May I come in?" She stepped aside. Ethan was sitting at the dining table with his math notebook open, and the boy looked up at the stranger, then at his sister, then back at the stranger. "Hello, sir." "Hello. Are you a friend of my sister's?" Cynthia opened her mouth to say something, but Carter answered first. "I'm a patient at the hospital where your sister works." "Oh." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "So you're one of the people whose blood pressure she checks?" "Yes. She's really good at it. She practices on my arm all the time." He held out his left arm, then pulled it back at once, the reflex of someone who had momentarily forgotten he was hiding something. Carter didn't look at the arm. He looked at the boy's face. "How old are you?" 16, sir. Almost 17. Ethan closed his notebook. "Please, sit down. Cynthia, do we have any coffee?" "That's not necessary," Carter said, but he sat down. He took the chair across from the boy and placed both hands on the table in the same way he sat in every room, while Ethan simply kept talking, naturally and easily, in the way of a child who had gone too long without anyone new to talk to. "What did you go in for, sir?" "My heart." "Is it serious?" "They tell me there's nothing wrong with me." "Oh." Ethan laughed. And you still go in to get checked? Yes. Then you're the opposite of me. The boy rested his chin on his hand. I'm sick every month. And every month I have to sit there and listen to people tell me all over again that I'm sick. It gets really tiring, sir. The part I'm most afraid of is when they put the needle in. They've done it more than 170 times, and I'm still afraid. I told my sister there must be something broken inside me. Carter said nothing, but she says there isn't. Ethan shrugged. She tells me that if I'm afraid, I can be afraid, but I mustn't run away. Being afraid is all right. Running away is the part that isn't. A brief silence followed. Carter lowered his eyes to the tabletop. During the past week, he had listened to many people say many things. Lawyers, federal agents, hospital administrators, and not one sentence had touched him. That one did. It had been spoken by a 16-year-old boy while closing a math notebook, and it went straight into the place Carter had allowed no one to enter for 3 years. Ethan, Cynthia said, go to your room and finish your homework. The boy picked up his notebook, stood, said goodbye, and went into his room. The door closed. Cynthia sat down in the chair he had just left. Say whatever you came here to say. Carter spoke plainly. He said he'd had someone review every record of Ethan's medical expenses, and that he would pay them all. Not part of them, but every one of them. The old bills, the expenses still to come, and every co-payment the insurance wouldn't cover. He said he knew someone on the board of a transplant center in Boston, and there were legitimate ways to have a case reviewed sooner, to have its priority score reassessed, to have it moved ahead of other cases. He spoke briefly, making no unnecessary promises, in the voice of a man presenting a plan that had already been calculated down to the last detail. Cynthia listened to all of it. Then she said no. You haven't thought about it. I've been thinking about it for 3 years, she said. Every sentence you just said is one I've already said to myself. Every time I pull open the drawer with all those bills, I think about it again. You're not the first person to offer me a way out. Your way is simply wider. She placed her right hand on the table. Your money, I know where it comes from. You don't need to argue with me. I'm not judging you. I'm only saying that I know. If I accept it, then every pill that boy takes for the rest of his life will carry something of that origin inside it. He'll grow up, and one day he'll ask me, and I'll have to answer. You don't have to tell him. That's exactly what I can't do. Carter was silent. And as for the list, Cynthia said, do you know what that list is? It isn't a line of people standing around for no reason. It's a real line, and there are 16-year-old children in it who are exactly like my brother, and 12-year-old children, and 40-year-old people who have been waiting for 5 years. No one in that line has money, and no one in that line knows anyone who sits on a board. She looked directly at him. If you move Ethan ahead of them, another kidney doesn't simply fall out of the sky. It means someone ahead of him gets pushed behind him. I don't know that person's name, and I never will, and that is exactly why I can't do it. Neither of them spoke for a while. Think about it, she said, rising to her feet. I took bullets for you. I won't sell you my brother. Carter stood as well. He didn't argue. He didn't say another word. He merely nodded once, very slowly, then walked out the door and descended 3 flights of stairs. The car was parked half a block away. He climbed inside, closed the door, and sat there. The driver glanced at him once in the mirror, then looked away. In 20 years, Carter Moretti had been told no many times. He had been refused by people with lawyers, money, guns, and powerful names to protect. He had always known how to handle those refusals because every person sitting across from him had something to lose. And whenever people had something to lose, there was always a price. Tonight, a woman who had nothing in her hands, no job, no insurance, $61,000 in debt sitting in a kitchen drawer, and one hand that could no longer close, had just told him no, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. He sat in the car for a very long time before telling the driver to go. 2 days later, Mateo placed a sheaf of papers clipped inside a blue folder on the table. Her personnel file, from her very first day. He remained standing for another moment. Start on page 4. Carter opened it. The first page contained what he had already guessed. Cynthia Quinn, born in November. She had earned her bachelor's degree in nursing at 22 from a nursing school in Newport, graduating with honors and making the department's honor roll 2 years in a row. Her Rhode Island nursing license had been issued that same year. It had never been suspended, and no complaint had ever been filed against her. Page 4 was her position assignment record, and there, Carter found a line he had to read twice. From August of the year she turned 22 until June. 3 years later, Cynthia Quinn hadn't worked in the outpatient clinic. She had been a night shift trauma nurse in the emergency department on the first floor of this very building. Carter turned the page. Her first-year performance evaluation rated her outstanding, with special recognition for her ability to manage multiple trauma cases and maintain the proper order of priority when several patients arrived at once. In her second year, she had been nominated for the department's rapid response team. There was a handwritten note from the chief nursing officer, stating that if she wanted it, she could be sitting in my chair within 5 years. Then Carter turned to the next page, and everything stopped. It was a request for reassignment. The request had been made voluntarily. It wasn't disciplinary, and it wasn't an administrative transfer. In the box marked reason, she had written 2 words: personal reasons. The request was dated June 18th, and above it, on the attached attendance record, Cynthia Quinn's final shift in the emergency department had been the night of June 14th, from 7 p.m. until 7 o'clock the following morning. Carter stared at the date for a very long time. Mateo was still standing at the head of the table, and he said nothing, because he had read it first and knew exactly what he had just set down. 3 years earlier, on the night of June 14th, 24-year-old Theo Moretti had been brought into the emergency department at St. Bartholomew Medical Center and had never come out. Theo was Carter's younger brother, 10 years younger than he was, and the only person in 4 generations of the Moretti family to study something that had nothing to do with the family. He had studied finance at Bryant, graduated at 22, and had a habit of reading balance sheets the way other people read newspapers, slowly and carefully, with one finger tracing every line. He never carried a gun. He hated having dinner at restaurants on Federal Hill because he said everyone stared when they sat there. During the final 6 months of his life, Theo had begun asking Carter questions about the books that Carter never answered, not because he was hiding anything, but because the questions irritated him, and because he believed he had the rest of his life to answer them. On the night of June 14th, Carter had been in Albany, 300 miles from Providence, attending a meeting that lasted until nearly dawn. His phone had no signal for 4 straight hours. By the time he was finally able to call back, it was 2:10 in the morning, and Mateo was the one who answered. And Mateo managed to say only one sentence before falling silent. Carter reached the hospital at 7:20 on the morning of June 15th. Theo had been taken downstairs 4 hours earlier. Carter didn't ask anyone a single question that day. He signed the papers, stood in the funeral home 3 days later wearing an expression Mateo would remember for years afterward, and sealed that night away as though closing a door he had sworn never to open again, because the only thing behind that door was a question whose answer he knew with absolute certainty he couldn't survive. He had never read his brother's medical records. He had never asked the name of a single person who had been on duty that night. For 3 years, he had done only one thing connected to that building, and he did it on the first Tuesday of every month, and he explained it to no one. There was one more item in the file. At the very bottom, clipped to the back cover, was a copy of a letter the Human Resources Department had photocopied to complete the record. It was from the hospital administration, dated 5 weeks earlier, and addressed to the patient's next of kin. The message was brief. The hospital was in the process of digitizing every record stored in the basement and would clear out the physical archive during the current quarter. During the inventory, staff had discovered several unclaimed bags of patients' personal belongings that had been stored there for years. Family members were asked to contact the hospital and retrieve them before the inventory period ended. At the bottom of the letter was a list of file numbers. Someone in Human Resources had circled one of them in ballpoint pen and written 3 words in the margin: the Moretti patient. Carter looked at the letter for perhaps 3 seconds, then pushed it aside. He didn't think about it. He returned to page 4. He read that line with the date once more, then once again, and every time he read it, it remained unchanged. "Do you want me to find the duty roster from that night?" Mateo asked. Carter didn't answer. He was staring down at the tabletop, but he couldn't see the table at all. He was thinking about something very simple and almost impossible to bear, something his calculating mind had no idea where to place. The woman who, 12 days earlier, had run across an open stretch of floor and driven herself into his chest. The woman who had gripped his wrist and told him not to be afraid while she herself lay bleeding on the tile. The woman who had refused his money the night before, with a drawer full of unpaid bills in her kitchen. was the same woman who had been in that room on the night of June 14th. She was the last person to touch his brother while Theo was still alive. Carter sat for a very long time with the paper in his hand. Mateo didn't ask another question, and he didn't leave. The following morning, Cynthia went back to the hospital for a follow-up examination of her surgical wound and sat waiting in examination room number 7 in the outpatient department. The door opened, and Carter walked in, and she knew at once that the man standing there wasn't the man who had taken off his watch and placed it on the table beside her bed at 3 o'clock in the morning. He didn't close the door. He stood 3 paces away from her. "I need to ask you something." His voice had returned to the one Russo had heard in the restaurant, flat, precise, without a single unnecessary word. 3 years ago, you worked in the emergency department on the 1st floor. Yes. You were on duty the night of June 14th. Yes. There was a male patient that night, 24 years old. Do you remember him? Cynthia didn't ask why. She didn't ask who Carter had been to that patient. Something in his face had answered that question before she could even think to ask it, and she sat still for about 2 seconds, then began to speak. She didn't search her memory. That was the first thing he noticed. When people tried to remember something that had happened 3 years earlier, there was always a moment of hesitation at the beginning. A furrowed brow. A quiet "let me think." She had none of that. She opened her mouth, and the words came out like a report someone had read over far too many times. At 11:41 p.m., the ambulance came through entrance number 2. Male, 24 years old, 3 penetrating wounds to the abdomen and left flank. On arrival, pulse 138, blood pressure 82/44, Glasgow Coma Scale score 13. I established 2 large-bore intravenous lines in both antecubital fossae within 90 seconds and began fluid resuscitation. The attending trauma physician arrived at 11:44 p.m. We activated the massive transfusion protocol at 11:46. She stared straight ahead, not at him. The patient's blood type was O negative. I called the blood bank the first time at 11:47, the second time at 11:52, the third time at 12:02 a.m., the fourth time at 12:09. All 4 times, the system returned the same message. O negative inventory at 0, awaiting allocation from the regional center. I recorded the time of all 4 calls. She paused for exactly 1 beat. At 12:11, I moved to the second option, using O-positive packed red blood cells for a male patient under the hospital's emergency protocol, while also requesting plasma and platelets. The first unit entered the patient's body at 12:18. She fell silent. Compared with when it should have been available after the first call, it was 19 minutes late. He said nothing. The patient was taken to the operating room at 12:26. The physician pronounced him dead at 1:52 in the morning, on June 15th. She placed her right hand on her knee. For 3 years, I haven't slept a single night without the number 19 somewhere inside it. I've gone back and calculated it more times than I can remember. If I'd switched to the second option after the second call instead of waiting until the 4th, I would have saved 17 minutes. I didn't. I waited because I believed the correct blood type would arrive, because the system told me it was awaiting allocation, and I trusted those words. She raised her eyes to him for the first time. I didn't know he was your brother. I didn't know until you walked through that door. Carter stood perfectly still. In 20 years, he had learned that the most painful way to wound someone wasn't to shout in their face. It was to say one short, true sentence, then walk away. He had carried one such sentence in his mind all evening yesterday and all morning today, and now he spoke it. For 3 years, I've come to this building once a month because I can't bear that night, he said. And you walked these halls every day, took my blood pressure 36 times, and said nothing. He turned away. I thought you were the only person in this building who saw me. He walked out. He didn't close the door, and he didn't look back, and the sound of his footsteps receded along the corridor until it disappeared completely near the elevators. Cynthia remained in that examination room for about 15 minutes. She didn't cry. She simply sat with both hands resting in her lap, one hand that could close and one that couldn't. At 11 o'clock, Human Resources called her to the 4th floor. Diane Kessler was there, along with a representative from Human Resources and Dr. Preston Vance in his capacity as department chief. Kessler spoke more briefly than she had the last time. She said that because of the current functional limitations in her left upper extremity, Nurse Quinn no longer met the minimum physical requirements of a clinical position. She said the hospital would place her on unpaid medical leave for an initial period of 90 days and would review her status after the neurological assessment results became available. She said her employee group health insurance would end 30 days from today, that she had the right to continue the coverage at her own expense, and that Human Resources would mail her a statement showing the monthly cost of that option. Cynthia knew what the number would be. She had explained it to her own patients dozens of times. She thanked them, signed where they pointed, and walked out. Vance sat at the far end of the table throughout the meeting and didn't say a single word. The night before, he had read both of her performance evaluations from the past 2 years, including the handwritten line from the chief nursing officer. He sat there staring down at the papers before him, hearing his own voice from several weeks earlier echo inside his head, the sentence he had spoken at the nurses' station, in front of 4 people who were new to the profession. In 20 years of practicing medicine, this was the first time Preston Vance had felt ashamed. He still said nothing. At 7 o'clock that evening, Cynthia opened the medicine cabinet at home and counted. Ethan had enough medication left for 4 days. 6 days later, at around 6 o'clock in the evening, Cynthia was home alone. Ethan was at the dialysis center on Chalkstone Street, and Cassie had driven him there, so neither of them would be back before 9. Cynthia was standing in the kitchen when she heard the elevator doors open in the hallway outside, but no one stepped out. That was the first thing. The elevator in this building made a very distinctive sound when its doors closed, and they hadn't closed. She stood perfectly still. The second thing was the footsteps. 2 people, walking slowly, and they stopped in the middle of the hallway instead of going directly to any door. The kind of pause people made when they were reading apartment numbers. Cynthia didn't run to the balcony. She didn't call 911 right away. She did something she had done thousands of times during her 3 years in the emergency department. She stood still and reconstructed the entire layout of the space around her. The building had 3 floors and a stairwell at the eastern end. That stairwell opened into the lobby below through a self-closing fire door. At the western end of the hallway was a second fire door separating the elevator area from the apartments, and that door was always propped open with a wooden wedge because people didn't like pushing it, and Cynthia had reported it to management 3 times, and 3 times no one had done anything about it. She knew exactly where that wooden wedge was. She picked up her phone, dialed 911, placed it on the table without ending the call, then opened her apartment door and stepped into the hallway. The 2 men were about 30 feet away, near the elevators. One of them looked up at her, and Cynthia recognized his face. She had looked directly at it from 13 feet away in the outpatient lobby at 2:15 in the afternoon, before everything broke loose, and she was the only person in that building who had looked straight at that face and survived. She understood at once why they had come. She didn't retreat into the apartment. If she did, she would be trapped inside a box with only one way out. Instead, she went in the opposite direction, toward the east, moving quickly but not running for the first 10 steps because, if she ran, they would run too. By the time their strides lengthened, she was 13 feet from the stairwell. She kicked the wooden wedge away from the bottom of the eastern fire door with the toe of her shoe, and the heavy door slammed shut behind her with the dry snap of the latch. On the other side, there was no handle. The door could only be opened from the hallway with a push bar, and that bar was on her side. She heard them hit the door. Once, then twice. She didn't go down. That was the second thing she did right. If she went down, she would emerge into the lobby, and the lobby had only one door leading to the street, and all they had to do was circle around by the elevators to reach it before she did. She went up. She climbed to the 3rd floor, left the stairwell, crossed the entire hallway, then descended by the western staircase, the one that couldn't be seen from the hallway on the 2nd floor because the elevator shaft blocked it from view. She did it with one hand gripping the railing, her left hand pressed against her chest, counting the seconds in her head the way she used to count them while squeezing a resuscitation bag for a patient who had stopped breathing. When she reached the last step on the 1st floor, she heard the lobby door burst open, a man's voice shout a single word, and footsteps racing back upstairs. Matteo Ferraro arrived about 40 seconds before the police. He was still limping, and he entered through the side door because he had parked on that side of the building, and he met Cynthia at the foot of the western staircase. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He simply reached out, pushed her behind him, and planted himself in the narrow space between the 2 walls. And he remained there until blue and red lights swept across the glass doors of the lobby. The two men fled through the rear exit. The police caught one of them in an empty lot 3 blocks away 9 minutes later. At 10 o'clock that night, in the back room of the restaurant, Matteo set his phone on the table. "They weren't looking for you," he said. This time, they were looking for her. "She's the only person who got a clear look at the first man's face." Carter nodded. He had worked that out from the moment he received the first call. "There's something else." Matteo didn't sit down. "They knew her apartment number. They weren't searching. They went straight to the second floor and stopped in exactly the right place." He paused. "She moved there 14 months ago. Her name isn't on the lease. It's still under the former owner's name because no one ever updated it. That address appears in exactly one place, her hospital personnel file." Carter looked up. "The file I just told you to get?" "Yes." Matteo looked at him. "And I had already obtained it 3 days before you gave that order because Mr. Aldo told me to prepare files on every witness who was present that day so we could give them to the lawyers." No one spoke. Carter sat very still. For the past 3 weeks, there had been a beam supporting the ceiling that he had never once looked up to examine. And now he had just heard a very faint sound from somewhere above it, the kind of sound a person could ignore if he wanted to ignore it. Carter said nothing. He drew no conclusions. But something cold traveled down his spine, and it remained there throughout the night. Near midnight, he went to the building on Doyle Street and stood outside the door of the second-floor apartment. He didn't knock. He stood there for about 3 minutes, and then the door opened from the inside because Cynthia had heard his footsteps stop, and she had been standing on the other side for just as long. Cynthia looked at him. "I don't need you to forgive me," she said. "I need you to tell me your brother's name. For 3 years, I've only called him the patient in bed. 4. Carter stood motionless for a moment. "Theo," he said. For 3 years, Carter Moretti had never reopened that night. Over the next 4 days, he opened it 1 layer at a time. The first thing he requested was the ambulance unit's dispatch log. The call had been received at 11:21 p.m. The ambulance had left its station at 11:23, and the patient had been picked up on Manton Street at 11:29. From Manton Street to St. Bartholomew, the standard route went along Atwells Avenue and took 6 minutes. That night, the ambulance hadn't taken that route. The record showed that it had been diverted north along Smith Street before cutting back down, a 17-minute route. And in the box marked reason, someone had manually entered a single line, traffic incident at the intersection of Atwells and Dean. It took Matteo 2 days to find that incident. There had been no accident report filed by the Providence police at that intersection on the night of June 14th. There had been no road closure ordered by the Transportation Department, no news report, no photograph, not a single line in any city record. The difference between the 2 routes was 11 minutes. The second thing was the blood bank log. Carter had to pay for it, and he paid without blinking. The results came back Wednesday afternoon. In St. Bartholomew's system, the supply of O-negative packed red blood cells was listed as 0 from 11:34 p.m. until 1:04 in the morning, exactly 90 minutes. But the physical intake log from the cold storage room clearly showed that 7 units of O-negative blood had been received from the regional center at 6:15 that same evening, and the inventory taken the following morning showed 5 units remaining. 2 units had been issued, and both had been issued after 1:04 for a different patient. During those 90 minutes, that blood had been sitting in cold storage about 100 feet from the emergency department, while the system said it didn't exist. The third thing was Carter himself. On the night of June 14th, Carter had been in Albany. He hadn't arranged that meeting. It had already been postponed twice, and the man who convinced him he had to attend, the man who said that if they postponed it a 3rd time, they would lose the relationship entirely, the man who personally chose a location outside the city where the entire party had no cell service for 4 hours, was Vincent Aldo. On Friday afternoon, Carter brought everything to the apartment on Doyle Street. Cynthia spread the papers across the dining table. Then she stood, went into her bedroom, and returned with a worn, hardbound notebook. She had kept it for 3 years. During those 3 years, she had opened it more times than she could count, not because she wanted to remember, but because she wanted to find the place where she had gone wrong. She turned to the page dated June 14th and placed it beside his papers. Then she compared them line by line, following each entry with the index finger of her right hand. The admission time in her notebook was 11:41 p.m. The time the ambulance left the scene in the dispatch log was 11:29, 12 minutes for a trip that should have taken 6, while the route recorded in the log was supposed to take 17. Her finger remained there for a very long time. Then she moved to the second column. Her 4 calls to the blood bank had been made at 11:47, 11:52, 12:02, and 12:09. All 4 fell squarely within the 90-minute period when the system showed 0 inventory. She placed her finger on the line showing 7 units received at 6:15. For about a minute, she said nothing. "I called 4 times," she said. Her voice was perfectly ordinary. "The blood was about 100 feet away from me. It was sitting in a refrigerator downstairs the entire time I stood there, squeezing the fluid bag and watching his blood pressure numbers fall." She closed the notebook. "For 3 years, I believed that if I'd changed course 17 minutes earlier, he would have lived. But if the ambulance had taken the right route, he would have arrived 11 minutes sooner, and if someone hadn't turned off that inventory entry, the first unit of blood would have entered his body at 11:50. She raised her eyes to him. "I did everything right." Then she began to cry. She cried without making a sound, her shoulders perfectly still, the tears simply running down her face as she made no effort to wipe them away. She wasn't crying from pain. She was crying because for 1,095 nights, she had put herself on trial in a courtroom with no other defendant, and now someone had laid 3 sheets of paper on the table, proving that the guilt she had carried for 3 years had never belonged to her. She had abandoned her profession because of it. She had pushed herself behind a desk on the first floor and taught herself that it was safer to take up as little space as possible. For 3 years, she had lived beneath a sentence written by someone else and placed upon her shoulders, and she had worn it without once opening it to see whose signature was at the bottom. Carter sat in silence and watched her cry, unable to say anything, because he had just realized that the 36 times he had walked into that building were also 36 attempts to pay for an identical sentence. The same night, the same author, the 2 people sitting on opposite sides of that dining table had carried the same guilt, though neither of them had committed the crime. The next morning, Cassie created an online fundraiser for Ethan, wrote 4 lines, and posted it. On the first day, 41 people donated. Cassie didn't notice that the first contribution, made at 6:12 that morning, was a large one, and that the donor's name had been left blank. That same morning, an application for assistance with immunosuppressant medication and treatment for end-stage kidney failure was submitted through a physician to the pharmaceutical company's patient assistance program on behalf of 16-year-old Ethan Quinn. The name in the recommending physician's signature box was Preston Vance. He told no one. On Sunday afternoon, Cynthia's phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. The message contained 3 lines. The first said that the sender had Theo Moretti's bag of personal belongings, the one the hospital had inventoried in the basement. The second said that if she told Carter about this, he would kill someone before he had time to think. He would lose everything, and she knew perfectly well that he would do it. The third contained only a place and a time. Basement Archive, St. Bartholomew. Alone. Cynthia went alone, and she didn't go because she was reckless. She had sat with that message for 3 hours before making her decision, and throughout those 3 hours, she had thought about only one thing. Whoever sent it knew exactly what Carter Moretti would do if he read it. He would go down there, and he wouldn't bring a lawyer, and after tonight, one person would be dead, and another would lose everything he had left. She had seen his face as he sat at her dining table staring at those 3 sheets of paper. She knew, so she didn't tell him. She arrived 40 minutes early. Her employee badge would remain active for another 11 days. She took the stairs down to the basement, and before she went to the place named in the message, she did 2 things. The first took 15 seconds. In the archive area, an emergency communication panel was mounted on a support column, the kind with a button that had to be held down while speaking, designed so warehouse employees could call the duty station when something went wrong. Cynthia switched the button to the open position and held it there with a binder clip. From that second on, every sound in the archive area was carried through the ceiling speakers on the 3 floors above and fed into the audio storage server of the duty system, which the hospital kept running 24 hours a day, and no one had ever listened to again. The second thing took longer. 3 years earlier, St. Bartholomew had held a voluntary 2-day fire and explosion response course, outside regular working hours and without pay. The entire emergency department had registered 4 people. 3 had dropped out, and only 1 had completed both days and passed the final examination. During that course, they had been taught how to activate the local smoke containment system manually from the control cabinet and the order in which the fire doors would close when the command was programmed by zone. Cynthia opened the control cabinet at the end of the shelving aisle and finished programming it at 9:22. Vincent Aldo arrived at 9:30. He came alone. He placed a clear plastic bag bearing a hospital label and a case number on the inventory table, and inside it were a wallet, a ring of keys, and a small black notebook. "You're early," he said. "So are you." "I'm always early." He pulled out a chair and sat down. And he sat the way a man sat in his own conference room. "You didn't tell him. Good. I gambled on that, and I won." He tapped one finger against the plastic bag. "Do you know what's in this notebook?" "No." 3 years ago, Theo Moretti started examining the records of a chain of clinics in Cranston and Warwick, along with a pharmaceutical distribution company registered in Delaware. He read slowly, but he read carefully. He was the only person in that family who knew where to look when a balance sheet didn't look right. Aldo spoke calmly, neither quickly nor slowly. "It took me 12 years to build that network. 12 years. Do you understand? The money moved through 3 layers of companies and came out clean. And no one in the Moretti family knew it existed, not even Carter's father when he was alive. You killed him." "I didn't need anyone to die," Aldo said. "That's what everyone always gets wrong. I needed something else." He straightened the plastic bag on the table. "If Carter dies, the entire family breaks apart. 3 factions go to war. The federal authorities move in, and I lose everything. I don't need Carter dead. I need a Carter burdened with guilt." He looked up. "You've watched him for 3 years. You tell me, what does a man do when he believes he let his younger brother die because he wasn't there? He doesn't examine the books. He doesn't ask why one number looks the way it does. He's afraid to look closely at anything connected to what happened 3 years ago. And he needs someone sitting beside him to lean on. And I was that person. And not once in 3 years did he suspect me." Cynthia stood motionless. "You were the one who told him to keep coming for his monthly appointments." "I advised him not to stop, and I meant it sincerely because I believed in it." Aldo shrugged. "Once every month, he walked into the very building where his brother died, sat in a room, and walked back out with that wound still open. No doctor could heal it, and I needed it to remain unhealed. 36 months, 36 times. And what happened 15 months ago? The hospital sent a letter to the next of kin, warehouse inventory, archive liquidation, an invitation to collect the patient's personal belongings." He touched the plastic bag. "This sat down here for 3 years, and it should have stayed down here for another 30. When I learned that he was about to be asked to come down and sign for it, I had to make a choice. I hired the Barone family. They were cheap, and they had reasons of their own, so no one asked questions." He looked at her. "Then you ran outside. I hadn't accounted for you. You were the only variable in the entire plan. Then you sent men to my home. You looked one of them directly in the face." Aldo said it in exactly the same voice he had used for everything before. "To it. Miss Quinn, I don't hate you. I didn't hate Theo either. I'm in the business of calculation, and this is how I calculate. Theo was an expense. You're an expense. Carter is an asset, and an asset must be kept in the condition that allows it to remain profitable." He stood. "Now I need this notebook to disappear, and I need you to understand that after tonight, you won't say anything to anyone." Cynthia stepped back exactly 2 paces until she was beside the column holding the communication panel. "I understand now," she said, "and so do all 3 floors above your head." Aldo looked up at the button being held open by the binder clip. For about a second and a half, his expression didn't change. Then, he took 1 step toward her, and Cynthia raised her right hand to the control cabinet at the end of the shelving aisle and pulled the lever. The zone alarm sounded twice. Then the Western Archive fire door slammed down, followed by the connecting corridor door, and then the stairwell door, in exactly the order she had programmed, and Vincent Aldo was left standing between 2 layers of steel doors inside a chamber, about 13 feet wide, with no way out. Cynthia never touched him once. She simply understood that building better than he did. Carter arrived in the basement 14 minutes after the duty station called. He stopped about 10 feet away and looked at the man who had sat beside him for 7 years. Matteo stood behind him, having decided before he even reached the bottom of the stairs that no matter what Carter did, he wouldn't stop him. 4 generations of the Moretti family had known only one way to end something like this. Cynthia stood at the head of the shelving aisle. She didn't move any closer. She only spoke very softly. If you do this, he wins. He spent 3 years turning you into a man who would be willing to do it. Don't give him the thing he spent 3 years creating. The room remained silent for a very long time. Aldo sat in the chair and didn't beg. Then Carter took one step back, pulled out his phone, and called Ruth Callahan. I'm in the basement of St. Bartholomew. Come here. When they led Aldo past him, the older man paused for half a step. Theo would still be alive if you'd come home on time that night. 3 years earlier, those words would have destroyed him. Now he knew who had written them and why they had been written, so he didn't answer. 4 days later, Dr. Preston Vance stood in the exact place where he had stood that morning, in the middle of the nurses' station, waiting until shift change, when nearly everyone who had been present the first time was there again. He said he had looked at 3 paper forms and decided within 4 seconds that he knew what kind of person had printed them. He had mistaken silence for incompetence, and that mistake belonged to him and no one else. He apologized without adding the word but. Cassie stood at the far end of the counter, and it was only then that she revealed what she had just discovered while completing Ethan's paperwork. The physician who had submitted the request to enroll the boy in the pharmaceutical company's medication assistance program several weeks earlier was Dr. Vance himself. He hadn't told anyone. An apology is a starting point, Cynthia said. I'll watch to see how far you go from here. Diane Kessler was suspended and placed under investigation because she had received 3 reports about failures in the building's access control system over the course of 2 years, and had filed all 3 away. She hadn't embezzled a single dollar. She had simply feared responsibility more than she feared the consequences, and now she had to answer for that order of priorities. As for Carter Moretti, he paid a price no one in the city believed he would ever be willing to pay. He signed a cooperation agreement with federal authorities, disclosed the entire money laundering network, and surrendered 12 years of records. Most of what 4 generations of the Moretti family had built was seized. He kept 3 restaurants and a transportation company that had always been clean, then used what remained to establish a foundation in Theo Moretti's name. Cynthia refused every sum set aside specifically for her. Her left hand still couldn't hold a syringe steady, but she could teach, and that year she created an emergency response training program for all of St. Bartholomew. 400 employees went through her class. The first person to register was Preston Vance. 6 months later, Ethan Quinn received a kidney from a deceased donor through the national waiting list, in his rightful place, with no one pushed below him. The Theo Moretti Foundation didn't buy him a place. It only paid his post-transplant expenses and the cost of his medication to prevent rejection for the rest of his life. On the afternoon Ethan was discharged, Carter gave Cynthia a leather-strapped watch. She turned it over. Engraved on the back were a name and a date, Theo Moretti, June 14th. Its hands had stopped at 1:52. They returned it to me with the bag of his belongings, he said. I wore it for 3 years, like a sentence. He folded her fingers around it. I don't need it anymore. Cynthia held the watch in her palm. Are you afraid? She asked. Carter looked at her for a very long time. Yes, he said. Don't be afraid, she said. I'm here. There are sins we didn't commit, sins fashioned by someone else and placed upon our shoulders, and we carry them for years simply because we never dared to open the sentence and see who signed it. There are people an entire building passes every day without anyone truly seeing them, until the day they're the only ones still able to stand. And sometimes, simply calling someone by their right name, letting them know they exist in our eyes, is enough to save a human life. If this story touched you, please leave a comment and tell us how it made you feel, and whether you've ever met someone as quiet and unseen as Cynthia, or whether you once were that person yourself. We would truly love to hear the thoughts you carry deep in your heart. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with the people you love, so that each day we can listen to more meaningful stories together. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health and a life filled with joy, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.